presentation. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me reset the podium at a normal human being's height. There. Welcome. This is a CME activity that is sponsored by the Hawaii Consortium for Continuing Medical Education. It's a joint venture between the Hawaii Medical Association and the John A. Burns School of Medicine of the University of Hawaii. For those of you who will be asking for continuing medical education credit, please use the white evaluation form to evaluate today's session. If you haven't obtained a copy of it, Noreen over on the side will provide you one. You'll receive CME credit in direct exchange for the completed evaluation form, so think of it as a free coupon. At the closing of today's presentation, we'll have a short Q&A session, and all audience members, including those attending by video teleconferencing, are welcome to ask questions by using the microphone. Please encourage anybody who is in the audience who has questions to use our microphone so that, in fact, as a courtesy to the distance sites, they can hear your questions. Consistent with HCCME's policy, speakers are expected to disclose at the beginning of their presentation any significant financial or other relationship with the manufacturers of any commercial technology, program, product, or service discussed in their presentation. This policy is intended to make you aware of the speaker's financial or other relationships so that you may form your own judgments about the material discussed. Dr. Thomas Cook has disclosed that he has no financial interest, arrangement, or relationship that could be perceived as a real or apparent conflict of interest in the context of the subject of his presentation. In fact, as a impending fourth-year resident in the Department of Psychiatry, he has taken a formal vow of poverty. Dr. Thomas Cook is a third-year resident in the Psychiatry residency program at the Department of Psychiatry. We are honored and pleased to have him. He completed his Doctor of Medicine from the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago. Dr. Cook has written a chapter on the ethics of organ transplantation that was recently published by Catholic University of America Press in 2011. And this particular grand rounds represents Dr. Cook's research project in the Psychiatry residency program, and he explains that instead of going into the field for data, he simply reads the books in the Learning Resource Center, LRC, located in the Psychiatry department. It's a novel and refreshing concept, which I suggest to everybody here. I'll reiterate the objectives. It's a formal requirement of this that we do so. At the conclusion of the session, you'll be able to identify cases of the genetic fallacy, which is a misapplication of the psychoanalytic method. Secondly, apply Winnicottian thinking to the problem of religion and wish fulfillment. And third, discuss how romantic poetry and arts weigh in on the matter. Please, in the course of this session, turn off your pagers, cell phones, and audio devices or set them to stun. Join me in welcoming Dr. Cook.
Appreciate that. Yeah. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So the future of an illusion, those of you that speak German would be able to pronounce that self to yourself. It was first published in 1927. Freud called it his little pamphlet. Its arguments immediately mark Freud as one of history's most persuasive atheists. To this day, the fields of psychiatry and psychology far exceed the other sciences in the number of those that do not believe in any sort of God. For myself, I don't have the honor to be counted in that number, but I can say that no book has so threatened my belief as this little pamphlet of Freud's. On first reading it, it grabbed me by the throat. And I think it would for any of you that would look at it. I wrestled with it for a couple years, and it sent my reading off in a good many directions. As I found, there's a burgeoning literature on psychoanalysis and religion, as there has been since the 50s and 60s. But anything like an adequate response to Freud is really hard to come by in the psychological sense. Many humanist or existential psychiatrists like Erich Fromm are compelled to agree with Freud, perhaps God does not exist. But then they take a step away and say, well, some had better believe anyway if we're going to get along as human beings in society. I have little sympathy with this view. It strikes me as a shirking of the question. And I feel more affinity for Freud, even as I attempt to roll him off me and administer a chokehold. If only because he had the bravado just to say what he thought was true. And that's my first point this morning. Me and Freud, and some of you who would more agree with Freud, we're kind of in the same camp, in the sense that ultimately no one really knows, with any finality whether God exists. The most well-read and persuasive atheists and theists both know this. That's why we keep on reading. No other subject which has more an impact on our lives is so unverifiable as to be comic. And whether what we see is all there is, whether when we die we rot or not, these are questions beyond all importance. But at the same time, they're so difficult as to be comic. So it's necessary to see that comic element. As Chesterton said, angels fly because they take themselves lightly. So that's the first of two caveats before I begin. One, though this is a heavy topic, please take it lightly or not at all. Ultimately, there's no surefire way to figure any of this out. And Freud would agree with that. Two, this is my method. This is not straightforward clinical research. This is even at the periphery of psychoanalysis. So I ask for your patience to draw from disciplines some would deem unscientific. And by that I mean logic, ethics, music, aesthetics. In other words, the liberal arts. St. Thomas Aquinas defined faith as the mean between science and opinion. Interesting way to put it. By science he means certain knowledge, science. By opinion he means the humanities. I think you can put, so for him, faith is an expansion of what can be known. It's an expansion. In psychology, I would say I would put in the middle point too. It's a science, but it's also a humanity. And so my own view of this faith reason problem is expansive and liberal, not narrow. I don't try to put strict boundaries around science. So what's Freud's central argument? Freud regarded the belief in God as so patently infantile and foreign to reality that it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never rise above this view of life. According to Freud, belief in God distorts the picture of the real world in a delusional manner and fixes people in a state of psychical infantilism. To Freud, the idea that the universe was created by a being resembling a man, but magnified in every respect, like an idealized Superman, reflects the gross ignorance of primitive peoples. So to substantiate these claims that belief in God is childish and primitive, Freud said that it's wish fulfillment. It's based on our desire for things to be so, rather than any calm investigation whether they are so. He says, "We shall tell ourselves that it would be very nice if there were a God who created the world and was a benevolent providence, and if there were a moral order in the universe and an afterlife. But it is a very striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. Religious ideas," he says, "are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. The secret of the strength lies in the strength of these wishes." By illusion, Freud means not something that's definitely false. That's like a more delusion. For instance, a young lady may wish for a rich prince to carry her away. But it is true that rich princes do occasionally carry off young ladies, whereas we call a delusion definitely false. An illusion is a wish, a hope, a longing which, he says, owes its origin to our wanting it to be true, something like a fixed daydream. And I know in our mental status exam we say illusion is a distorted perception, but that's not what Freud means. He means something that we don't reality test. We believe it just because we want it. The origin of belief in God, he explains in terms of child development. Further, he wrote, "In this function of protection, the mother is soon replaced by a stronger father, who retains that position for the rest of childhood. But the child's attitude to its father is colored by an ambivalence. The father himself constitutes a danger for the child, perhaps because of its early relation to the mother. Thus it fears him no less than it longs for him and admires him." Freud says the indications of this ambivalence and the attitude to the father are imprinted deeply in every religion. When the growing child finds he's destined to remain a child forever, that he can never do without protection against strange, superior powers, he lends these powers the features belonging to the figure of the father. So in Freud's view, our feelings that God is to be feared and loved are rooted in the child's mixed feelings to the father, who, as a rival to the baby, he can usurp the mother's breast at any moment, seize her body away, threaten the baby, and yet he's also loved because he protects the baby against nature. Now, it's interesting that in this explanation, wishes play the prominent part. The infant boy first wants or wishes mother as a love object, but as he also wants unlimited protection from the father, and because the father threatens attainment of the first wish, possession of the mother, a conflict arises between the wish for the mother and the wish for protection. So the result is a conflict. This conflict produces fear and anxiety in Freudian theory and ambivalence. And this is very important to this talk, so I will say it again. To Freud, wishes are deeper, they're more primary than fears. Fears are a result of conflict, but wishes come first. A religious person might say, God is fearful and that we need to appease his wrath. But to Freud, this is a disguise for a wish. The wish is more real, that lies beneath. And usually a selfish wish. So religion's a cover, it's a self-deception, which hides a deeper motive of wish for protection. The same theory, the theory that a fear conceals a wish, Freud uses to explain anxiety dreams. Freud maintained all dreams are driven by wishes, but anxiety dreams seem to contradict this. Why would you want to have an anxiety dream? Why would you wish for that, right? For instance, one woman dreamt that she ran out of salmon, and she couldn't host a dinner for the neighbors as she promised she would. In the dream, she's very anxious and fearful of being embarrassed socially. Freud took her history and explained that her dream was constructed on a wish to withhold all salmon, indeed all food from her neighbor, indeed to downright starve her. For this neighbor was a rival for her husband's attention. This neighbor was on the thin side, and her husband had recently commented he preferred his women plump like my wife. So the dream's anxiety and fear of social embarrassment at the prospect of running out of food is a deception. Perhaps she had truly felt that way once, but it was a cover that concealed a wish to be the sole possessor of her husband. Dreams of being naked in public, Freud says, explains the same way. We've all had them. The sort of dream one has in elementary school. You lose your clothes in the schoolyard. You try to hide behind something. I know I'm not alone in this, right? You guys are so quiet. I know you've had it, okay. And always, oddly enough, no one seems to notice you're naked. Well, to Freud, these sorts of dreams conceal a wish to expose yourself to others. So the fear is fake, the wish is real. Since exposing yourself intentionally is, unacceptable, there is anxiety in the dream, but this is smoke and mirrors. This is all secondary reaction to the deeper wish to expose yourself. That explains, Freud says, why in such dreams, and those that you watched Inception, listen to this, that's why the others are indifferent to your nakedness in the dream. If in the dream they showed signs of enjoyment in seeing you naked, the cover would be up. You'd wake up, the dream would stop. That's why they're indifferent. That's why the dream has to make them indifferent. Now this is very clever theorizing, and Freud was probably one of the most clever men in history, but I think it's vulnerable to a strong critique, which is this. So look at repression versus dissociation. Repression was Freud's idea. Dissociation doesn't actually even appear in Freud. That was Pierre Janet's term, his contemporary. In repression, what is repressed is not a faithful depiction of an event, but an event or a wished-for event that has taken on a traumatic quality only because our wishes distort it. And in Freud's opinion, our wishes, drives, instincts have little to do with reality. They just want satisfaction, that's it. Your id is a groping beast, a Grendel that lives underground and cares not for the light of day. It is not afraid of much. Rather, it is we that are afraid of it. Whereas, so those are the 2 points I just made. Whereas dissociation is an accurate response to something outside, something real. Dissociation has more bearing on reality. You see this in our PTSD criteria still. We require that the trauma be real. PTSD nightmares are unlike Freudian dreams. They tend to be vivid and repetitive and the same. I find it interesting that in Freud's entire dream book, 700 pages, there's almost no mention of nightmares. There's anxiety dreams, but not nightmares. So he focused on the primacy of wishes, and he discounted the primacy of fears because of this theory he set up. And I think that's responsible for our lack of progression in the understanding of dissociative illnesses because of the Freudian influence. It's well known that he changed his mind about incest trauma, originally thinking some incestuous act had occurred, then later saying, I have ceased to believe in my traumata. Instead, he believed the wish, the expectation, was what made an event traumatic. For instance, a harsh word from a stranger, that's not traumatic. But if it's a love interest or an authority figure, someone from whom you expect, sex or a promotion, that becomes traumatic because the wish determines that. That's the mature Freudian view of trauma. This matters a lot because to Freud, as we said, fear is not sincere. It's secondary, a mere cover-up for a selfish wish that is primary, that drive. Belief in a fearful God who's supposed to exist outside is Belief a God which is supposed to exist outside is a self-deception, a cover-up for infantile wishes which are real, but only in our minds. So belief in God is a cover-up for a kind of cosmic narcissism. But what if we turn the tables on Freud? Supposing God exists, would not his existence be a trauma? And especially in the dissociative sense rather than a repressive sense. God or no God, there are real traumas out there, but in his writings, Freud focuses little on them. When his adult daughter Sophie died of influenza, Freud remarked to a friend, "I do as much work as I can and am grateful for the distraction. The loss of a child seems to be a grave blow to one's narcissism." So traumatized by a real event, Freud, as if by habit, blames not the world, but something in himself. To Freud's atheistic mind, the world is all there is. The world can do no wrong. It is what it is. The world is, was, and always will be itself. To Freud, it's our wishes that are always causing mischief. Now, if I can critique this, to Freud, the problem is with us. We expect too much out of life. We want life to go on forever. We want things the world cannot give. Religion owes its strength to exploitation of these childish expectations. But I rather think that Freud may have exploited something else, and that is our propensity to find fault with ourselves. Suppose you call a man across the street, "Hey, jerk!" He turns around. "So you think you're a jerk?" Now this is silly enough as a schoolyard trick, but it's problematic if you take this seriously. There's other reasons for turning around. Maybe he wants to see the jerk that called out, "Hey, jerk." There's a humorous scene in Dickens where, as often happens in Dickens, a group of friends have had way too much to drink. Some pass out, others stay up to go out dancing. To go out dancing, a coat is needed and is borrowed from one of the slumbering men, who the next morning notices, "My coat's been worn." That's curious, he thinks. Immediately a man bangs on the door and challenges him to a duel. The strange man says, he being the owner of the coat really ought to know better. He's the guilty party who only the night before danced with another man's wife, thoroughly insulting him. Will he accept the duel on his honor or not? I was drinking last night, he thinks, and what happened after that I have no memory of whatsoever. Indeed, he had no recollection of dancing with anyone's wife, much less dancing at all. But he accepts the duel. And that's the comedy. He had had a bit too much to drink, and who knows what one's capable when one is unconscious. Now this sort of bottomless self-blame is what gives, I think, Freud's much of his psychoanalytic theory and his atheism much plausibility. There's a moralism behind it. I would say even a puritanical moralism. The idea that our deepest wishes are selfish, deceptive has a special sting to it, as if you can't disagree and say, "No, my wishes are reliable and trustworthy," without embarrassing yourself. It's easy for Freud to win this argument, just as it's easy for a missionary to tell naive, primitive peoples that their mythologies are all false and sinful, because mythology comes from our longings, our wishes, which are sinful. But really think about it. The idea that our deepest longings and wishes are always leading us into self-deceit is no more necessary than the idea that they lead us to the truth. Consider a moment that you are in prison. The analogy is apt because we're talking about self-blame here. It's a well-fortified prison with little chance of escape. You're chatting in the cafeteria. One prisoner tells another, "I hear there's a tunnel underneath this prison." The prisoner listening to this happens to have read Freud's Future of an Illusion. "Hogwash," he says. "Of course you've heard that. That's what everybody wants to believe. I suppose there's a pot of gold at the other end of it, too." The first prisoner feels ashamed and returns to the man he heard it from. "I'm never falling for that again." What happened here? Has any progress been made as to whether there is or isn't a tunnel underneath the prison? Or has one man bullied another man out of his hopes? After all, there may actually be a tunnel underneath the prison, regardless of whether anyone hopes there is or fears there isn't. Suppose again, this world as we know it is one but one large prison we've lived in all our lives. Suppose we're in doubt as to whether we are not born into a prison. Is there an outside? Is there a way outside? Whether there is or isn't, it's a fallacy to say that our hope for one is misguided because, as Freud says, all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. It's a fallacy, and it even has a name amongst logicians and philosophers, the genetic fallacy. The chemical model for the benzene ring, for example, the scientist dreamt that a snake was eating its own tail. If I were to argue that the chemical model for the benzene ring came from a dream and was therefore false, I would be committing the genetic fallacy. Truth is truth. Fact of the matter is, regardless of where it comes from, whether pure observation or through a psychological route. There have always been two competing philosophies about how we know things, how we find out what's true about the world. One's empiricism, the other rationalism. And I'm not taking sides in this talk with either of these philosophies, but I'm just showing where Freud lies. Empiricism conventionally means truth comes from outside, rationalism from the inside. And Freud wrote within the empiricist tradition of John Locke and David Hume, and he developed it by showing how wishes, which come from the inside, are deceptive and cause us to lie to ourselves. To Freud, wishes and reality testing don't go together. They can't. The id is not interested in reality. It doesn't want the truth. It wants pleasure and illusion, not truth. But I think Freud's picture is simplistic. Sometimes we find truth by paying attention to what's inside more than what's outside. And I'm going to give some examples. Einstein, for instance, said certain equations he hadn't proved yet. He said they must be true because they're so beautiful. He had a hunch that they were true because he first felt their beauty inside his mind, subjectively. Piaget, you guys know who that is, whom Einstein knew and happened to call a genius, in much of his work questioned empiricist assumptions by showing truth comes from internal factors. A schema, for instance, is an internal guide to discovering the world in the cognitive tradition. Piaget poked fun at the empiricist tradition by remarking somewhere, do they really think that it was discovered by experiment, that there is no number so large that another cannot be added? Imagine trying to find out whether there's a number so large that you can't add one. You'd never finish, right? Some things, as it was obvious to Piaget, are not arrived at by experiment, nor by any kind of observation. So take an idea like justice, and I'm off Piaget now. Take an idea like justice. How about patient autonomy? Have justice or patient autonomy been observed? No, they're values, they're invisible. We observe instances of justice and autonomy, but even then we're not talking about something quantifiable or countable. We're talking about an intuition, a feeling that some action is just whereas another action is not just. Does that make justice less real or based on wish fulfillment? Think about science itself. Science assumes nature as a whole, even the furthest reaches of the cosmos, follows laws discoverable by the human mind. And not only can we discover these formulae, but they're all intelligible to our minds. None of this is arrived at by experiment. It's assumed before any experiment begins. For instance, consider our cocksure idea that the laws of gravitation, which we discovered, holds true to the furthest reaches of the cosmos. In one sense, it seems self-centered to claim that, but in another sense, it's reasonable, it's common sense, and it's a working assumption of science. Consider that we, again, are the only species in the history of evolution to have discovered any laws, or to have realized that evolution happened. Could we really say, that can't be true because it sounds like wish fulfillment, putting us on a pedestal? Because all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. The philosopher Immanuel Kant was, as a young man attending an astronomy lecture, his professor said, astronomically speaking, you see, man is insignificant. And Kant shot back at him, astronomically speaking, sir, man is the astronomer. The philosopher Voltaire, in the same century as Kant, spoke about how ridiculous it was that man considers himself the sole object in the cosmos with free will. Every other object in the cosmos follows predictable laws, except for man. We hold ourselves an exception. One might say we humans have an unconditional faith in our self-importance. Now we can either condemn and reject that part of ourselves or accept it and get along with it. Consider what we do in CBT. We examine the evidence for someone's false beliefs about themselves. So you think you're a total failure and worthless? So have you really failed every time? So we examine the evidence. But now think about a basic positive schema. I am valuable to the world. My life is worth living. Is there really any evidence to examine that someone's ultimately valuable to the world? Or their life is worth living? No. I would say no, really. We assume these things are true apart from any experiment, and I think reasonably so. So on all these points, the beauty of Einstein's equations, ethical values like justice or autonomy, the idea that nature follows laws to the furthest reaches of the cosmos, the worthwhileness of human life, on all these points, what is inside is more important than what outside our minds, in terms of what guides us into the truth. And one more word about art, and then I'll get off this slide. Art, like religion, is notorious for its illusions, no? Famous for its half-truths. Isn't it the nature of art, like dreams, to mix truth with lies, reality with fantasy? Isn't religion, especially mythology, in the same category as art, strictly speaking? Charles Dickens, for instance, describes a man lighting a candle as persuading a candle to light. Now, in one sense, that's growth anthropomorphism. Candles don't have feelings. They aren't subject to persuasion. But in another sense, the word is very apt. Candles really do require persuading. Everyone's been in a corner with a candle, hands cupped, as if for privacy. So the metaphor is true, but not literally true. Like poetry, religion pushes at the limits of language. It uses half-truths like the idea that God may be persuaded as any human being may be persuaded, in order to get beyond the limits of language, to get at divine realities for which we really don't have any adequate language. Consider the Shakespeare line, "Full many a glorious morn have I seen, flatter the mountaintops with sovereign eye." Now, the sun doesn't have an eye, right? It doesn't literally flatter anyone. But can you think of a better or scientific way to describe the way the sun casts itself across a mountain ridge? It's impossible. That's why Heidegger said poetry is more objective than science. We must use words that aren't literally true to get at the truth. All mythology, I would argue, is like that, and so is all language about God being high up, covered in glory, too bright to look at, capable of being persuaded, etc. Again, suppose a man is born blind and asks us what the color scarlet looks like. He's never seen any colors. He wants our best description of scarlet. To say it's just a beautiful color means nothing to him. So we consult an optics textbook. We go back, we say, it's a wavelength of 650 nanometers. There you go. This means nothing to him. Frankly, it means nothing to us either. What is it like to see scarlet? Someone else goes up and says, it's like a trumpet blast. The blind man smiles and thanks us for the information. In a way, we are all men born blind. We require, and religious language provides information that is at once both illusory but purportedly true. The psychoanalyst Winnicott said, we need to be able to reach out for symbols and to create imaginatively and in pre-verbal language. We need to be able to think hallucinatorily. To think hallucinatorily, poetry and religion are exactly what Winnicott's talking about. To tell a blind man that scarlet is like a trumpet blast, that's like a synesthetic hallucination if you think about it. It's like saying the key of B minor is like tasting a mushroom. It's akin to saying that God is at once nothing like a human being and yet is like a human being in certain ways. Winnicott noticed during World War II that young children evacuated to shelters suffering an unnatural break from the mother were less able to think this way. They became little reality testers, little skeptics, unable to tolerate illusion. In weaning the breast, the mother is supposed to gradually disillusion the infant of the omnipotence of its fantasies. But Winnicott did not consider it a part of normal development to completely disillusion any child, nor to completely disillusion anybody. He believed the role of illusion should not disappear, but ought to be dissipated over all of reality so that we may have an experience of reality meeting our wishes and yet reality still remaining real, durable, and itself. For Winnicott, this is why children drag their blankie in the dirt, and they don't want mom to wash it. This is also why babies like to knock over towers of blocks, per Winnicott, only to build them up again. And that's why I think all artists feel at least somewhat discontented, even destructive, toward the finished product of their work. Every artist wants to know whether their creation, their illusion, can take on the status of reality. Part of us wants to see if our little towers can survive our destructiveness and so take on the status of reality. So again, back to the genetic fallacy. Just because we want something to be true doesn't mean it isn't, and doesn't mean we are painfully aware of our wanting it to be true and can't take a middle position towards it. The same way we feel towards art. Wishful and skeptical, hopeful and fearful, creative and destructive, all at the same time. The balance is hard to maintain. Usually one of the emotions takes over. Freud, for instance, I think, bullied himself out of his hopes, like the bully in the prison who bullied the other prisoners out of theirs. Consider looking at it the other way. Is a belief more likely to be true if it realizes our fears? Is there likely to be a roach under your toilet seat because that's the last thing you'd wish for? If you're dying of thirst in a desert and you see an oasis a mile away and you suspect it's a mirage, indeed you fear it may be a mirage, is it therefore a mirage? Kay Redfield Jameson, Johns Hopkins bipolar researcher, in her autobiography An Unquiet Mind, attests to this state of being bullied by your fears. She tells that in her struggle with bipolar, she held off trying lithium until her mid-30s because she feared it wouldn't be the miracle drug she hoped it would be. When she finally tried it, she found out it nearly was. Remember the girl from Miracle on 34th Street? And this is the best 1947 version. Her mother is upset when, without permission, she's taken to see Santa. And then she remonstrates with the guy that did. I didn't think there was any harm in saying hello to the old gent. I'm sorry. Well, I think there is harm. I tell her Santa is a myth, and you bring her here to meet a convincing old man with whiskers. Well, what's wrong with that? By filling her full of fairy tales, she'll grow up believing life is a fantasy instead of a reality. She'll keep waiting for Prince Charming to come along, and when he does, he'll be a... And like a good psychotherapist, he responds, we were talking about Susie, not you. The point of that interaction is that the mother's skepticism and rigidity is personal. She had once wanted life to be a fairy tale and then was disappointed by some man. She had been taken in once and she would not be taken in again, nor allow her daughter to be. Regarding belief in God, someone may be so afraid of being taken in, so to speak, that they refuse to be taken out. And they may turn against that part of themselves that seems to want to take them out. That's what faith is, to be taken out of the prison of your own rational mind. To be taken beyond what is just observable, derivable, provable. And so for those of you, I imagine that if you are an atheist, you have once or twice found yourself saying, "'Twould be nice if the world were as you theists say it is, but I'm afraid it isn't." Well, if I may kindly point something out and be psychoanalyst for you, that's too easily translatable into, "But I'm afraid it isn't." The words, "I'm afraid it isn't," can be taken in two ways. One as having bearing on reality, or they can be taken as having bearing on the emotional life of the doubter. Let's take a classic line of Voltaire, predating Freud. If God did not exist, we would have to invent him. Then let's turn that upside down into a remark at Chesterton's, and take a moment with this. If there were no God, there'd be no atheists. What is he suggesting? Is it that atheists want to be without an all-perfect being who can grant their every wish? Why would they give that up? I think what Chesterton is suggesting is that we owe, and this is, we'll get to this later, but this is more of an ad absurdum argument. It's not necessarily fair to always be a psychoanalyst. And I think if you're an atheist in the audience, you'll feel that way right now, and that's part of the point. What he's suggesting is that we owe the existence of atheism to a kind of energetic denial. Because he exists, he must be denied. Carl Jung remarks that fear may lead to the denial of a feared object. It must always be borne in mind that the fear of spirits is sometimes so great that people will actually deny that there are any spirits to fear. I have come across this myself among the dwellers on Mount Elgon, Kenya. That's Jung. But surely God solves more problems than he creates, right? He fulfills more wishes than he does fears. Well, not necessarily. If God's a real person, and this is more my own thinking, if God's a real person, he can harm us more than nature can. Nor can we predict whether he will harm us nor when. There's no corner that he's not around, no bush that he's not behind, no place to hide. He stalks us like a hunter. The denial of his existence is then a defense against the threat of his approach. PTSD research shows that interpersonal trauma is far worse than trauma, say, caused by an earthquake or other natural disasters. I remember feeling mildly dissociative at the birth of my own daughter. For one moment, I saw her on the giraffe warmer, covered in amniotic fluid, and I remember thinking, that shriveled little thing can't be a person. It's an animal, a mass of tissue. It will one day just die. And I recovered from the horror of this vision only later coming to understand it was a defense against a deeper horror. And that's the great mass of responsibilities my daughter would lay on me. The threat of her person. The bizarre and frightening mystery of two persons suddenly becoming three. So let me play you a bit of music. Right, Dracula, right? Dracula. No, that's Bach. That was originally religious music heard in Lutheran masses, right? The fact that we have come to associate it with vampires is, I think, really telling. By making something into a nightmare, we make it less real. This, I believe, is the psychology behind PTSD nightmares. I haven't read this anywhere. But as I have mentioned, I think Freud left us no basis for understanding PTSD nightmares. A PTSD nightmare is not, like most dreams, a wish fulfillment. It's a fear fulfillment. And it's nonetheless a fantasy. Now, God, if he exists, is truly threatening. A man with his face burned, wearing a mask, living in the sewers, not so much. We've done something similar with angels, I think, in history, artistically making them babies that hover. But in the Bible, when an angel appears, it says people tremble like leaves, they fall on their faces. Angels are always having to tell people, do not be afraid. That's the first thing they said. It must be terribly inconvenient to be an angel. Let me play you what follows in that Bach clip. Okay. Now, can you imagine any music in the first part of that making you feel any more uncomfortable? I would say it feels like dissociation for me. Remember, this was church music. As the chord rises, becomes more and more dissonant, we get more and more disturbed and unsettled. Listen to that again, the first part. Resolves and it's not dissonant anymore. Since the time of the High Baroque, Christians, for instance, stopped saying Holy Ghost, and now they say Holy Spirit. But you can see how Holy Ghost really comes closer to what Bach's getting at there. If someone said, let's just think behaviorally, if someone said there's a tiger in that room, you might get a sympathetic response, right? But it would be nothing like the feeling you'd get that Bach gives you. If someone said there's a ghost in the next room, you may not get a sympathetic response, but I think the feelings you'd get would be a little closer to what you feel there. Let me just see. Now, here's a Rembrandt painting of Jesus calming a storm. We're told in the New Testament they're terrified of the waves. Jesus is sound asleep. They plead with him, do something. He calms the storm. We're told the disciples were then more afraid than they were at the beginning. And in Greek, the words are phobon megon, megaphobic, very afraid. So the fear of nature is supplanted by the fear of a person. This is very important because according to Freud, going back, it's our fear of nature red in tooth and claw, nature godless and unparented, that compels us to believe in a God that guarantees a good crop of corn, rain, and life after death. And this was originally Ludwig Feuerbach's argument that Freud borrowed from very heavily. Again, if God the person is possibly more threatening than death by drought or death by storm, then believing in him has not the soothing effect that Freud might say it does. Now, Freud wouldn't disagree that people greatly fear God, but he would argue that the fear is secondary, as I mentioned, to a narcissistic wish, which is primary. Of course, says Freud, of course God is intelligent like us, but more so. Good like us, but more so. Gets jealous and wrathful like us, but more so. Because he's a projection of us and of our wishes. But look at it the other way around. Freud may say we believe in God because we desperately want the world to play nice, because we want there to be a moral world order. But I would say that Freud, this is again my thinking, I would say Freud disbelieves in God because he's afraid of a moral world disorder. You see, as Descartes noted a long time ago, if God exists, he can be good, but he can also be bad. Only man can behave worse than nature. One man may occasionally slaughter another man as a tiger slaughters another tiger, but no tiger ever went about pacing his den plotting to rid the world of jaguars. A monkey may occasionally strangle another monkey, but no monkey invented a machine for beheading other monkeys, right? It seems there's no evil man is not capable of. Why would we want to project that possibility onto God? Why not rather take refuge in nature and say that's all that exists because that's where we're most comfortable? Nature may be herself morally disordered, but at least she's repetitive. The forecast for tomorrow is cloudy with a chance of showers. If there's lightning, we're surprised, but not really surprised. Nature acts as she must, and that's a consolation. But God can throw lightning out of a blue sky. He may allow, as he did for Job, the worst evil to fall on you and refuse to say why. How is that wish fulfillment? At least after floods and tsunamis, we say, well, it couldn't have been helped. We can't say that about God. When Freud was a little boy, his father told him of a time when a man knocked his father's hat into the mud, yelling, "Get off the sidewalk, Jew." Young Freud was horrified when, asking his father how he responded to the attack, he said, "I complied with the man's wish, and I said nothing. I turned the other cheek." As an adult, Freud related his father's cowardice wounded him deeply. He was dismayed that his own father, who's supposed to be a hero, could be so passive. In his writings, Freud is harshly critical of Jesus' words about turning the other cheek to enemies. He looks with suspicion, Freud does, as did Nietzsche, on any teaching that smells like a moral system designed for slaves to keep them slaves. By the way, you want to see there's a slide of Freud looking suspicious. That's a real great photo you may not have seen of him. But what if I were to say that Freud could not accept God because God, like Freud's father, stands by while evil happens and does nothing? Did Freud not later identify with the man who yelled at his father by going to push believers off the sidewalk of their faith? Did he not go on to knock the cap of reason off the head of religion? Listen to the following words of Freud in 1928. I find it's really hard not to hear in these words both Freud's bitterness and resentment towards God and at the same time his father. As for myself, God had not done so much for me. He would never have allowed me to hear an inner voice, and if in view of my age he did not make haste, it would not be my fault if I remained to the end of my life what I now am, an infidel Jew. My thinking again. Freud became the bully in the prison. To those who long for escape, he says the prison may be harsh, but the prison's all there is, and they're better off facing that fact. But suppose Freud, for all his harsh realism, is secretly paralyzed by a fear that if there is a world outside, it's a worse one. By outside, you can easily just say beyond this universe or in the afterlife. Marx and Nietzsche both claim to be setting people free from their prisons, the prison of their belief in God. Nietzsche called religion slave morality, meaning it was a moral system designed to keep slaves, slaves. I think you can see in Nietzsche the same crippling fear already noted, and especially the fear of other persons that can take advantage of you. So too did Marx call religion the opiate of the masses before Freud, meaning that religion is nothing but a scheme for keeping poor people poor and keeping them hoping for heaven while they waste their only chance at happiness in this life, which is the only life there is. C.S. Lewis, who's very sadly underread. He had a really nice way of turning all this skepticism on its head. He said, "Who talks the most against escapism? Jailers." Somehow, these masters of suspicion, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, never asked whether by their suspicion, maybe they did, I haven't read all of them, but they never asked whether by their suspicion they were forever locking themselves in a world that is not all there is. Speaking of happiness, let's get back to psychology. Here's Maslow's hierarchy. To Freud, our wishes for shelter, food, and sex are authentic. To Freud, the physiologic needs are the driving wishes, just back to my beginning, the bottom. They're driving forces of all behavior. To Freud, these wishes are reliable. They have something to do with reality. That's what I mean by reliable. But what about our higher needs, like having a purpose in life, peak experiences, the sort of experiences that you might call religious? It seems, according to Maslow, that these peak experiences are the very point of the lower needs. The lower needs build up, and I've read Maslow's first essay, and he does say this. The lower ones build up to the higher ones, support the higher ones. But Freud is relentless. They are illusions. Freud said, for instance, once you begin to think about the meaning of your life, you've become sick. So he considered these higher questions morbid. Try thinking of this in terms of child development and the trust a child develops as they take on new risks in the world going up the hierarchy. And imagine a little boy playing with his father. And I'm going to give a demonstration. So this is from, I've ripped this off of Peter Kraft. He's a philosopher, very published. Daddy, can I jump off that little wall? Sure, Timmy, jump off that little wall. I'll catch you. Okay, Daddy, here I go. Whee! That was fun. The little boy is you. The father is nature, or all that is. Your trust in finding satisfaction for food, sleep, shelter is now stronger than it was before. Now you're going to be ready to jump off a higher level, going up Maslow's hierarchy. Say, Daddy, can I jump off that higher wall? Sure, Timmy. I'll catch you again. Okay, Daddy, here I go. Whee! That was fun. Again, your trust is rewarded. There really is love. There really is self-esteem. Your creativity really is rewarded. Your trust in the fulfillment of your wishes is strengthened, enabling you to take bigger risks, bigger risks, bigger risks. Finally, Daddy. Yes, son? Can I jump off that really high wall? Well, okay, son, if you insist. Daddy, I'm scared. Will you catch me? I'll catch you. Okay, Daddy, here I go. Whee! Splat. So, suppose our central religious longings, our deepest longings, are all illusions. Suppose our longing for, or what they seem to point to, make us make up illusions. Suppose our longing for complete happiness, peak experiences, a moral world order, meaning in life, like, for instance, people often say, well, I know everything happens for a reason. We ever think about biology and, like, what nature is and how chaotic and meaningless nature is? I mean, according to Darwin and a lot. I mean, does that really make sense? Everything happens for a reason? Really? You think that? Consider they're all illusions. What I'm getting at here is, why would nature lead us on? Why would nature continually gratify our lower wishes but deceive our higher ones? Is life one big joke? Freud doesn't believe in demons, but he seems to think our wishes are as deceptive as demons. And those of you with philosophy background, you can see how he's related to Descartes that way. Freud is such a relentless skeptic that ironically he proves too much, my thinking. Religion may be too good to be true, but I think Freud's world is too bad to be true. So I want to read you a long quote from C.S. Lewis. Most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, first think of some foreign country, first take up some subject that excites us. And again, this is the top of Maslow that Lewis is talking about. These are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I think everyone knows what I mean. The wife may be a good wife, the hotels and scenery excellent, and chemistry may be a very interesting job, but something has evaded us. Now, there are two wrong ways of dealing with this fact and one right one. The first wrong way, and I'm still quoting Lewis, the fool's way. He puts the blame on the things themselves. He goes on all his life thinking if only he tried another woman, or went for a more expensive holiday, or whatever it is, then this time he would really catch that mysterious something we're all after. Most of the bored, discontented, rich people of the world are of this type. They spend their whole lives trotting from woman to woman, continent to continent, hobby to hobby, always thinking that the latest is the real thing, and at last always disappointed. The second wrong way, the disillusioned, sensible man. And I would comment this is the category that he's implicitly putting Freud into. He soon decides the whole thing was moonshine. Of course, he says, one feels that way when one's young, but by the time you get to my age, you've given up chasing the rainbow's end. And so he settles down, learns not to expect too much, and represses that part of himself which used to cry for the moon. This, of course, is a much better way than the first, and it makes a man much happier and less of a nuisance to society. It tends to make him a prig, but on the whole, he rubs along fairly comfortable. It would be the best line we could take if man did not live forever. The third way he calls the third man. The third man says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So, and then cutting into the quote for a minute, taking the opposite line of Freud, that our wishes may be real biologically, but they lead us into illusion. Lewis's reasoning, no, if our wishes are real and if they're universal and innate, as many like Jung's archetypes would be, then we can reason from them as an effect to their cause, the cause being the reason they're there, their fulfillment is also real. So back to the quote. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death, and I must never let it get snowed under or set aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country. End quote. Note that the first man condemns the world or his past choices in the world. The second man condemns his wishes. The third man doesn't condemn his wishes or the world, he just thinks, it's all a big misunderstanding. As Chesterton implied when he said, and get this, the man who knocks on the door of a brothel is really looking for a cathedral. Only he doesn't know it. The sexual longings are conscious, the religious longings beneath them unconscious. Lewis called this desire Sehnsucht, and he probably chose a German word, which means sick with longing, but he probably chose a German word because of the Freudian element in London, which was so heavy in the 40s. This is what Carl Jung, and then one last point, and then I'll be done. This is what Carl Jung at least somewhat implied when he put religious archetypes in the collective unconscious. The archetypes keep welling up, whether we want them to or not. Now, to Jung, interesting, the question of God's existence was pointless, since everyone either believes in God or, he says, treats something else as God. Jung said, the idea of God is an absolutely necessary psychological function of an irrational nature. I therefore consider it wiser to acknowledge the idea of God consciously, for if we do not, something else has made God, usually something quite inappropriate and stupid, such as only an enlightened intellect could hatch forth. As usual, Jung's making fun of the West. To Jung, atheism is impossible in practice. As Jung pointed out, in modern societies, as soon as people doubt their belief in God, the government is suddenly God, represents God. This is, for him, the return of the repressed. AA actually teaches this point in one of their maxims in a book entitled Not God, and that's the first step to overcoming addiction, to say, no, I'm not God. And AA is really big on this. So they take that Jungian stance. And Jung partially started AA. he treated one of the founders, actually. Nietzsche was right on the mark on this point, actually, and I find, unlike other atheists, he didn't claim to be scientific or rational. He was a poetic atheist, an irrational atheist, and he actually argued one time, God does not exist. If he did, I could not tolerate not being him. Therefore, he doesn't. Now, I think that may sound crazy, but there's a psychological honesty there that I think is miles away from Freud. Chesterton, for instance, one more paragraph. Chesterton said that blasphemy, and even blasphemy of a skeptic or an agnostic, is nevertheless a tribute to God, whether or not it is accompanied by conscious belief. If anyone doubts this, Chesterton wrote, let him sit down seriously and try to think blasphemous thoughts about Thor. That's a psychodynamic comment, which I know you'll notice. Whether or not blasphemy is accompanied by conscious belief, it's always accompanied by unconscious belief. We might even call blasphemy a religious slip of the tongue. It is in such blasphemous slips that honesty comes out. So Freud, like all human beings, sometimes just can't help it. Freud didn't seem to notice much his own wish to live forever through his work. Man is naturally selfish. He sacrifices mice and rabbits to improve his condition. He declares what laws are followed by the entire cosmos. Man cannot help treating himself as a god with a lowercase g, as the imago Dei on earth. And we can't help it, no matter whatever side of this question you fall on. You can't help treating yourself that way. But that doesn't necessarily make you a fraud. That's the end of my talk. So I've raised a lot of questions and issues, and I've taken perspectives and approaches that I know you'll probably disagree with, some of you. And maybe you do agree with it, but I'd like to hear what your questions are. You don't have to ask a question if you just want to make a comment that doesn't even need a response.
Hi. Doesn't, but I'm going to try to be loud. First of all, thanks. I think that obviously any human can relate to the issues raised in this talk, which made it clearly relevant and interesting to us. And I want to thank you for having the courage to take on such a topic for your grand rounds. I wanted to, I think it's very important to be clear that we need to have some conventions in the terms we're using. I think that's one of the most difficult parts. But staying with your convention, if the way you point it kind of interesting, you kind of locate the wish further down. It makes me think of the topographic theory. So if wishes are indeed deeper than fear, is then God the super ego construct, do you think? In where God is rather a successful attempt to create an agency that would rather prevent us from, imploding versus exploding under the internal pressure of the id, opposing the external pressures.
I think Freud would totally agree with, I would agree too. That is Freud's theory, because the wish to have mom, sole possessor of mom, leads to the fear of the father, and then that leads to, taking in that criticizing, harsh fatherly role into the superego and identifying with him. That is
Because then I think that under this can be a model for the ego, rather. God as a construct of the ego, a safe ego, that's sort of a manual or a handbook on how to live this life safe, sort of. So in that respect, I think the atheism has risen as there are alternatives to living life safely outside of this construct of God. But I think that ultimately your talk is rather about determinism versus free will. Because if apparently we have been equipped with assets that become a liability. So if I get to think of inevitability of death and having control over it, is it in my control or is it part of something larger?
Yeah, you're right that the approach that Lewis takes and that I'm taking, and Maslow I think implicitly takes, is that some of our longings for the top of the hierarchy are Yeah, well, that's a tricky question because one of them could say, well, God put that Sehnsucht, that longing for God, God put us in there, and so it's a determinism, a theological determinism. But Maslow, I think, would not be a determinist in terms of, because he's implicitly thinking like we're trying to get after satisfaction for these things. So that definitely comes into.
And lastly, do you think that one would rather have a need to evolve through how one feels about God rather than having to deal with the attacks to one's construct and one's, a sense of identity in regards to this model, and just have to defend through one's life the internal as well as the external attempts to adjust or to change this? That's where I'm going with being born in a family where there is a strong religious component. And I'm thinking, for example, Jung with a father who was a preacher versus Freud, who was rather, obviously have a Jewish background and they were seculars.
Yeah.
But still, Jung thought had the vision of the cathedral in Basel, being destroyed by a large piece of fecal material landing from God in himself. Where rather Freud, I think, tried to get into the different mode. Can I endorse religion and be safe and just and be satisfied with it?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, from your personal perspective, where is rather the answer, you think?
Well, I think you got to tease out psychology and psychoanalysis from what you think is true, because psychology doesn't really, well, it gives us a datum, like Maslow gives us what he considers a datum of, primary experience. We have these longings, we have these. So psychology helps you along the way, but I don't think psychoanalysis really is a way of finding out what's true. As you could probably see from the talk, it's so when you say undergoing your evolution, I think definitely that's not as an analyst. That's more as a everyman kind of thinker, just a philosopher, just amateur philosopher, which we all are, so.
Thank you.
Yeah. No problem. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Is there a VTC question at the VA or somewhere else? Daniel? Thank you.
I was wondering, my question is more, I really like Jung's the quote that you gave towards the end of your speech, how Jung referred to that there was somewhat a need for religion, and that there is a construct, we are going to create something. There's going to be some maybe yourself or whatever, or God.
Yeah. Sure.
What did Freud think about the need? Did he ever feel that it's a need for religion? Did he say people created religion because it allowed them to do this?
Well, like any good analyst, he wouldn't see it as primary. He would see it as a construct, something more on the top of the analysis. You got to kind of dig deeper. He didn't see it as primary. Jung saw it as primary. So they're kind of disagreeing. When kids play baseball and they decide who's going to be home team and they do the bat? Bam, whoever gets it. That's Jung and Freud. They go back and forth. Jung, Freud, no, it's all sex. Jung, no, beneath sex there's religion. And then Freud, no, belief.
Did he recognize that basically what he had done was create his own religion?
Who? Did who recognize?
Freud, that the fact that he created his theories was creating a religion. The way he views the world and explains the world and explains himself and explains the reason he's here and why he thinks and acts the way he does and how we all do. He is a religion.
He definitely wouldn't use those terms. I think he would consider science and what he calls in civilization its discontents logos. He even deifies the idea of reason. It's kind of right.
When science refers now back to psychiatry or psychoanalysis or Freud's theories, it looks at it the same way as it looks at religion. That's why we get discredited often.
Well, analysts have a pedigree, right? A lot of analysts will say, who analyzed them, who analyzed them. It totally resembles apostolic succession of like a church. There's a lot of ways that psychoanalysis does resemble religion. But I don't think Freud, regarding the Jung question, I like Jung. I just think his background being Swiss and frankly somewhat Protestant too in his view of man's nature as being, this is somewhat outside the bounds of the talk, but man's nature being so fallen, you can't help doing these things. You can't help be rational. An atheist can't even help being rational. We're all irrational. So for Jung, the question, in a philosophical sense, trying to figure out what's true, he doesn't really look at that seriously. And I'm not so sympathetic with Jung for that reason. I'm much more sympathetic with an atheist. I feel like they're right next to me if they believe in reason, if they're men of science and stuff. That's because I partially disagree with Jung on that, but it's all whatever position you want to take on that. You got to find evidence for yourself. How high or low your view of reason really is. And for many psychoanalysts, their view of reason is quite low. And we have that in our, we've inherited that into our field, a really low view of human reason. Allison.
I think one of the greatest faults whenever we go into philosophy and assumptions about other people is we assume we know what makes other people happy. We assume what happiness looks like. Perhaps greater than the idea of truth and greater than the idea of beauty is that we assume there's some universal idea of happiness. And a couple times you made mention of these things like, oh, well, nobody's going to find that beautiful. And, oh, it's just so wrong. There are many people that would find that beautiful. So I would caution, again, we do not understand other people's happiness. Psychiatry is the idea of understanding other people's misery, but we cannot assume to understand other people's happiness because it often does not look like ours. And that's all.
Sure. So if I can comment, so the question there would be, can you ever be a scientist on some of these questions that are at the top of Maslow's hierarchy? Is it possible to universalize, to look at innate longings? Like, for instance, the fact that no one... Yeah, so whether you answer that question yes or no, that'll determine, where you stand on that issue.
No, I'm saying that was not my question at all. There was no question. It was merely a comment.
Okay.
No problem. Thank you very much, by the way. That was extremely fun.
Thanks.
Kind of to expand on what Allison said, I would also agree in the sense that violet is not a trumpet to me. It's more a car horn. Scarlet? Scarlet, even. Okay.
Sure.
And I think that's important, and it goes along to the same way as that I always had a problem with Heidegger. Truth and beauty are not universal in that sense. It's not objective. It's very subjective. And also with that pyramid, I think there's a correlation there. And I wonder what you would feel about the problem of semantic arguments versus logical arguments, because I think there needs to be a careful distinction of the two. With that hierarchy at the bottom, you had food and you had shelter, or I guess Maslow did.
Sure.
But, we're lucky we live in a society where that is at the bottom of the pyramid. And we live in a society where agriculture and architecture provides that for us, which kind of comes down to science and technology that's allowing for that. Yeah. And I wonder if I think it's something that's the kind of thing that science, like Allison was saying, would provide maybe answers for, whereas the top of the pyramid, that's not really our domain.
Yeah.
But what is in that domain, though, is that the wavelength of violet or whatever it was is 800 nanometers, and that is what is universal. And that, which is extreme. That was, if I had time, I was going to bring up. Yeah, the elegance thing that is there too,
Yeah.
and you can find poetry in that.
So there's a whole like literature on literary criticism and whether there's truth in poetry or not, and if there is truth in poetry, what kind of truth? If there's truth in fairy tales and fiction, and if so, is it just subjective or is it objective? Winnicott, on that question, which is why it's really great to read Winnicott, he doesn't take a side. He doesn't say it's purely subjective and purely objective. And even Paul Ricoeur, which was a French existential philosopher, thought that atheism serves a really important function in the West at wiping away the subjectivity and the projective side of poetry, religion, and mythology, so as to get us to sharpen those half-truths. Sharpen saying, scarlet's like a trumpet blast. No, it's not. Well, when you're willing to argue, no, it's more like a, what did you say it was?
Car horn.
If you say it's like a car horn and I say it's like a trumpet blast, that really is like a person, say a Hindu or a Muslim and a Christian getting together and saying, what language do you use for God? And then them being like, oh, okay, and then, so I think
But
my
the
take
objective
would
language
be-
that'd be true for all of them is what the actual wavelength is, and that's why I think the elegant beauty would be.
yeah, yeah. So I think Winnicott here to stick to psychology rather than you didn't, but for me to stick to psychology rather than like philosophy, and to stick to Winnicott, you really have to stick to the idea that none of them are right, and yet they're all right in an analogical way. Take a halfway, a middle position, and that's for me been the position of health in religious traditions and in
Excellent, thank you.
in Winnicott. Yeah.
I think that what we're all revolving around is the idea that God is compromise formation. We're looking at different psychological perspective or different religious perspective. I think that
Sure.
what's universal, no matter how we talk God or religious,
Compromise. That's a good
is
way to
that-
put it.
is that it ultimately addresses the same basic unmet needs or intrapsychic conflicts in a way which is societal and culturally acceptable,
Yeah.
historically also, not only here and now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you guys for your comments. Yeah, all you guys.